so much. I am honored to be here. Thanks for spending part of your Tuesday night with me. So I like to give sort of a brief roadmap of how a class is going to go, just so you know what's around the bend. And so the plan for tonight, it's going to be a pretty action-packed hour. And so we're going to start with just kind of a few definitions of flash fiction or short stories, because I think it can be kind of helpful. I do think they are sort of their own genre. So we'll kind of get that in our heads. And then I have two prompts, one that kind of focuses more on content, what kind of material might be suited for this form, and then one that focuses a little more aggressively on structure and how you might effectively structure a very short story. So it's only two prompts, but I hope it's going to cover a lot of bases for people. And then at the end, there will be a little bit of time for a few more tips. And so we won't have time necessarily, because this is a good turnout. There's like 15 of us, so there won't be time for everybody to share what they wrote, but there will be time to kind of pause and discuss and say things we noticed or say how it felt to write. So there will be some interactivity. So that's the map for the trip that we're about to go on. So I'm gonna start sharing my screen, and we'll kick off with some of these definitions. So hopefully thumbs up, everybody can see the share, I think. So a little bit of background, you might have seen it in the library page. I'm a co-editor of Rose Metal Press, and that is a press that's been around since 2006, which is eternity in small press years. I can't believe it's been that long, like 15 years. But we kind of specialize a little bit in what we call hybrid genres. So genres that blend multiple characteristics of other genres. And so, like I said, we do consider flash fiction or words of 1,000 words or shorter to be its own thing, and it can have similarities to poetry, it can have similarities to longer fiction, but the flash is something that we definitely think has kind of its own conventions, which can be helpful to think about. So I do like to just get into a little bit of history, and this is from the Rose Metal Press Field Guide to Flash Fiction, which is kind of a textbook or a book that individual writers can get if they're interested in learning more about this genre. But our editor, Tara Almasi, sort of got into the history, which we think is cool. And so this is sort of from her introduction, and then from a few of the people who are in there. So definitions by length are for editorial convenience. For the editors of Collier's, an American magazine published from 1888 to 1955, a short was a story that fit on one page of their magazine. The editors of the original flash fiction anthology, which is a book that came out earlier in the late 90s, picked 750 as an upper limit because this could be printed on two facing pages of a digest-sized literary magazine. Page layout and word count definitions don't say much about the experience of reading or writing shorts, however. So I like to start with that. That's Tara's research, credit where it's due. But it's interesting to me as someone who's an editor that kind of this subgenre originally arose because that was the space they had in different magazines and different anthologies. So I will say that for the purposes of tonight and for the purposes of Rose Metal Press, we use that 1,000 word upper limit, but different people go different ways. So to get more into that experience of reading it, I have Bruce Holland Rogers, and we'll read one of his full short stories later on. But he says, I do like the definition offered by fellow writer Kate Wilhelm in her introduction to my short collection, Flaming Arrows. As Kate expresses it, a novel requires the reader to explore an entire house down to snooping in the closets. A short story requires that the reader stand outside an open window to observe what's going on in a single room. And a short requires the reader to kneel outside of a locked room and peer in through the keyhole. For me, that captures an essential characteristic of most shorts. They are not just short, but also typically compressed. So if you were a note taker, which you don't have to be, this is pretty chill, but if I always like to take notes, I would definitely write down compression, because I think it's not just like 1,000 words and you've done it. There has to be this sense of compression that I think is really important. And you'll see that in both of the stories that we'll read in their entirety. And then Tara again says, each drop encases its own separate note, the way each drop engulfs its own blue pearl of light. This description of rain from Stuart Diebeck's story Nighthawks is as close to a definition of flash fiction as I can personally offer. A successful flash enchants us, each small story successfully rendered engulfing us for a brief moment in a flash, its own brand of light or truth, and the effects linger on, sometimes for decades. And so I think that would be, you know, if I were a note taker, I would take that note too. You kind of want to create something, I mean, this is kind of true, hopefully, of any literature, but you want something that lingers. So even though a flash or a short is short, the time that your audience spends kicking it around in their head or like feeling it in their heart should be long. So I think sometimes there's like a rookie idea that a flash fiction or a short has to just like pack a punch or be like, you know, kind of a shocking twist. And I think that's usually less effective than something that can be more lingering. And then two more, Deb Olin Unferth, who her book, Barn 8 that just came out last year is kind of told in little flash fictions. It's about a heist on a chicken factory farm, so I recommend that. But she says, flash fiction is a place for reckless daring. You write strange sentences in a new voice. You attempt bold plot structure. You explore a topic you've always avoided. But playing isn't enough. You must also take risks. And so I like that. I think of flash, because it's short, you can do something really big or really stylish that might be harder to sustain over like a 200-page novel, but you can kind of get away with it or have fun with it for like a shorter amount of space. And just like an example of that is in this novel of hers, Barn 8, she actually has certain sections that are from the voice of a chicken named Walk. And so they're kind of in like chicken speak in a way. And it's, you know, I wouldn't necessarily want to read a whole novel like that, but it's cool that she does it in these quick little flashes. Finally, Julio Ortega. The most famous flash fiction in Spanish is by Augusto Monterroso, a devilish Guatemalan who lived as an exile in Mexico. It reads, "When the man woke up, the dinosaur was still there." A number of readings unfold. A man wakes up and finds himself many centuries ago. Dinosaurs are still around, only in another time zone. A man wakes up inside another dream and has to kill the monster to be free. But also, a series of parallel flash stories are possible. When the man slept, the dinosaur stepped out of the museum. When the dinosaur woke up, men were already extinguished. The man awoke in the mirror and he found a dinosaur. So I like that. You know, I like that Julio has this like tiny little story that kind of offers all these different interpretations. So I think, you know, as much as I'm offering 1,000 words as the limit, you can also go much shorter. And the couple stories that we're going to read tonight are just a few hundred words. So we'll pause after this first prompt for a chance to kind of like touch base, but I want to make sure you all get the full prompt experience. So I think rather than me reading it, I would love if a volunteer could just unmute themselves and read Death of an Ortolan, which is by Nicole Rivas. It's 497 words, so you don't have to read for too long, but volunteer.
I can volunteer. Oh, sorry, I interrupted somebody. Kim, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. How do we pronounce this word, Kathleen?
Oh, Ortolan?
Ortolan. Okay. Death of an Ortolan. On my first date with Penny, I was very nervous because I was only 19 and Penny was 52. Over coffee, she told me that she was divorced and had 2 kids, both older than me. Actually, Penny was already a grandmother. She said her grandson's name was Carapace, which I know for certain because I had to ask twice. Penny and I talked a lot about the war, and I said some pretty stupid stuff that I quickly regretted, but Penny didn't see things that way. "You have a beautiful mind, like a curly Q," she told me. I had never been on a date with a woman before, so I hid my hands beneath the table and tore my paper napkin into tiny pieces. I couldn't believe it when Penny said she wanted to see me again. I went home that day and wrote all about it in my diary. On our second date, Penny and I went to the aquarium. She paid for both our tickets because I was only working part-time at a pizza shop and making minimum wage. Penny, on the other hand, was a gynecologist. More specifically, she was my gynecologist. When we were watching the piranhas rip apart a human cadaver, I said, Penny, I've been thinking, and I'll feel terrible if this turns into something real. I don't have anything to offer you. I'm not even in college. And I couldn't believe it, but as soon as I said that, Penny grabbed me by the shoulders and kissed me on the lips. Her tongue was like the inside of a tomato. When she pulled away, she said, it's too late because this is already something real. I love you more than I love my own children. On our third date, Penny and I had a picnic and she showed me how to eat an ortolan. I thought we were just about to get some cheese and maybe some grapes, but she pulled these little balls of foil out of her picnic basket. And when she unwrapped them, I saw that they were tiny birds. She explained that they were caught in nets, stabbed in the eyes, fed excessive amounts of grain, drowned in jars of brandy and roasted. I was horrified, which led to a deep philosophical conversation about good and evil. But before I could get reoriented, Penny said, hurry, eat your ortolan, it's getting cold. And I suddenly realized that I didn't want my ortolan to get cold, even though that morning I'd never even heard of an ortolan. Penny handed me a cloth napkin to put over my head while I ate the bird bones and all, a tradition. I was so nervous because this was only the third date with a woman I'd been on, let alone a gynecologist, my gynecologist. And it was a good thing those napkins were cloth, or else I would have ripped them to shreds all over again.
All right, thanks, Kim.
Wow.
That was great. It's hard to read something cold, especially I think something so like twisty and surprising, but you did great. So we don't have like heaps of time to discuss it, but I would open it up, and I can't see you all, so you can just like unmute and hop in. If you feel inclined, you don't have to, or you could drop it in the chat, but just things you notice about this. This is the one I picked for content, but I think there's also interesting form things that she does. So just things you notice, like about how she's able to tell what to me feels like a really full story that gives me a sense of these two people in just 497 words, which is like nothing.
One thing I noticed that I've seen in other flash fiction is the idea is when you're compressing, like you think that someone wants to get rid of as many words as possible, but even in 400 and whatever words, she's still able to use these repetition, a gynecologist, my gynecologist, so it got used a few times and a few other things. So it's that even though it's small, there's still not this fear of repeating when it's effective.
Yeah, that's a great observation. And one, not to steal anybody else's answer potentially, but something that strikes me with the repetition used very judiciously to add to that compression is, on my first date with Penny, on our second date, on our third date. So she is able to sort of take you through time. But she doesn't, to keep with that compression, she doesn't set the stage or show her waiting. She's just like 1, 2, 3, like we just go right through it. Other observations, other things we notice about how she's able to really tell the story in such a small amount of words.
It's interesting to me because I'm much more oriented in my writing as well to long form fiction, that she does something similar in terms of getting to information gradually. So the title is intriguing, but we don't really find out what it means until almost at the end. And also that the speaker is female, we don't find that till towards the end either. And both of those things, I think, add to the drama of the piece.
Yeah, definitely. I would agree with that. I think, you kind of like, it's sort of a story that's about this person who's in over her head, and you kind of get very gently that feeling yourself too, where you're sort of like, what's happening? And it's very, I don't know, I find it, even though I've read this a bunch of times because I love this story so much, it always sort of surprises me. So I think, there's more we could say, but I think if you just kind of keep in mind like the compression, the judicious use of repetition and sort of how she leaps through time. And then also just like, she kind of picks a really momentous occasion. There's not a lot of leading up to it, you know, we don't get any details on why she had to go to the gynecologist or why she never went to college, or, you know, we just kind of like get that information. And of course, the ortolan is this like shocking food item. And I think, you know, I had heard of it before, but it's, I think, always shocking when you hear about it. It's outlawed, it's illegal in France. And I think recently there was like some scandal where someone in Italy or France, like a bunch of officials like flouted the law and ate a bunch of these. So it's this very like a decadent sort of upsetting thing to eat. So with that in mind, because I think it can sometimes be hard, I think a bad prompt would be, okay, like write something with a lot of compression, you know, pick some content that's really compressed. I want to give you something really specific. So I have my prompt here. So I would like for you, and you'll have just about 10 minutes to write, so it's okay if it's not a whole story, but I would like you to try your best to do a beginning, middle, and an end in a very short time. Write a story that revolves around an item of food in some way. A wedding cake, a Thanksgiving turkey, a mangosteen, an atomic fireball candy, what have you. The food doesn't necessarily need to be the primary focus of attention, but will hopefully act as a trigger or symbol, which should spur a vignette that captures something of greater meaning. So kind of, you know, in a way, do your own imitation of what you see Rivas doing here. And I'll time you, and you won't share what you've written, so don't worry about being perfect. You might make a few comments on how it felt to write like that, but you don't have to share what you wrote. So just like have fun with it, get out of your comfort zone. It's just for you for now. So good luck. Just about 5 more minutes. So again, try your best to have an arc with a beginning, middle, and end of some kind. About 2 minutes. All right, so we're right up at 10 minutes just about. So if you're still jotting, finish your thoughts. The idea here is definitely that you'll have a draft of something. It won't be perfect, but it's something that you can work on later or use as a jumping off point. But rather than sharing like whole stories that we wrote, I'm just interested as to how it felt to write in that way, both with like the idea of compression, like the kind of content that could be compressed in mind. And then also like, if you want to share what food you chose, like how that felt. Maybe if everybody is shy, you can just drop what food you wrote about in the chat. Just type the food you chose. Or if you didn't do the prompt, be like, I didn't do the prompt.
I spent about 5 minutes just trying to figure out what food I wanted to do. You know? Now, wait a minute, come on, just move. I did cheesecake.
Cheesecake. And Denise says strawberries. Kim says pepper.
I did a rare steak.
Oh, rare steak. Joanne did aquamarine cotton candy. We've got goat from Dave. We've got dinner roll from Sheila. Anybody else? Wild strawberries. Very Bergmanian.
Mhm.
Does anybody want to share how it felt to kind of write with that approach of like compression, or how it felt to try to imitate what Rebus did? If it felt easy, if it felt frustrating, if it came naturally, if you also had to sit there and think for 5 minutes about just like what your topic was going to be. That's what I always do with prompts. If there's no pressure.
I don't know. I feel like I just kind of started with like very concrete like facts, because like imitating like the story that we read, because I feel like usually with my writing I kind of like meander like with details and like really like imbuing like what the scene is and like I don't know, just like descriptions of characters, and that I kind of had to like avoid that and just like kind of say like what was like most important to the like the plot and the structure of the story.
Yeah, that's a great observation. And I think that makes me think kind of what, you know, Bruce Holland Rogers said, where it's like, you know, if fiction is a house, like this is just the keyhole. You can't like wander through the rooms touching everything. You have to just like look at what you want to look at. Other observations?
Well, I agree with Nico, and I, you know, what I had to start with was I just started typing ideas, thoughts, just random, you know, free typing, and then it just kind of started to flow after that. So of course I need more time. I need to edit and polish and all that stuff. But it just started to flow after I started writing a few facts and ideas and just little phrases or words or anything. So, oh yikes. So, yeah, I had to start letting it flow, but I certainly, this was a hard exercise for me because I don't write that short. It always comes out really long.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's a good challenge. And I mean, everybody, I feel like there's so many quotes that get attributed to Mark Twain. So I don't know if he really said this, but it's his whole like, sorry, the letter's so long, didn't have time to write a short one, you know,
Yes.
which I think is kind of true.
Yeah, I found myself like crossing things out, you know, I'm freehanding it, and I would start describing something. I was like, no, I don't need to go into that. Like, that's not, you know, having to stop the normal, you know, descriptive, you know, habits.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, like in any form of writing, you know, you want significant detail. I think I love the phrase significant detail as one of those like workshop pieces of vocabulary to share in common, because of course, significant detail, like we know writing needs detail, but I love that adjective significant, because it's not just that you need a bunch of detail indiscriminately peppered in, you need the details that are significant. And I think in flash fiction, significant detail has to be so significant, or, you know, and that's why you do often just like cross stuff out, because it's not going to end up significant. Maybe like one or two more observations, positive, negative, neutral, about how it felt to approach something this way. Yeah, Cecilia.
I just ended up with a lot of questions because I couldn't pursue them. I couldn't go down the alley, you know. So I'm writing nonfiction, so it's memory based. So there are a lot of questions, but in a longer piece, you might be able to, you know, open the door and go in. But this was just like, wait, was that the way I thought it was? So
Yeah. Well, and I you know, realize I'm grateful that everybody's here tonight, but if you're interested in nonfiction, I'm doing, you know, the nonfiction one next week, and we'll talk more about that. And then if I can make a book suggestion, like I think to your point, like nonfiction often does benefit by being discursive or by opening the doors and like roaming around. And so I think a good example of that is this book called Evidence of V by Sheila O'Connor. And it's evidence of V, and V is her grandmother. And it's the story where she discovered that her family had hidden this secret like all her life till she was an adult. And she didn't find it out till later that her grandmother had become pregnant when she was 15 by a much older man and had been sent to, it was called a reform school, but it was basically a prison essentially. Like she was essentially incarcerated from age 15 to 21 for having this baby. And so she tells this whole story in like flash fictions and nonfictions. And so it's very, she kind of solves that problem, Cecilia, of like, okay, I want to use this form and it's going to like hold me back sometimes. So she sort of, I don't want to say cheats. I think it's really ingenious. She tells the story in these short little chunks, and it really lets her like have her cake and eat it too, or have her ortolan and eat it too. So, so good observations. I think next, just to keep things moving, it's already 7:05. So I want to go ahead and I'll share my screen again. And we'll look at one, like I said, that was, obviously form and content are inextricable. So I don't want to say like forms over here and contents over here. But this is a more like form forward story. So if I can once again have a volunteer to read this 381 word story, just unmute yourself and hop in.
I'll read it if you
Okay,
enlarge it a little bit.
go ahead.
Oh, enlarge it? Sure, sure.
That's
Good or
good.
good?
That's good.
Okay.
Are you ready?
Yep.
The House of Women by Bruce Holland Rogers. Women were all I knew of family. Family meant a household with my mother and 3 sisters, so much older than that they loved me without rivalry. Rivalry they reserved for each other. Other boys had fathers who took them hunting. Hunting was, for me, a mystery of guns and blood. Blood mysteries in our house were different. Different boys came courting my sisters, giving me quarters to go away. Away is where they took my sisters, eventually. Eventually, it was just the 2 of us, me and my mother in a house I tried to fill with a loud guitar and an old Mustang that spent most of its time on the garage floor in parts. Parts were the vehicle of my initiation, for when my friends were with me, we could speak the code of cams and carburetors and go to a country that we imagined was for men alone. Alone and on my own, at last, I found further paths into the world of men. Men working with me at the garage, went for beers after work, bowled weekends, hunted in October, all to be away from their wives. Wives and children, they joked, were God's punishment for youth. Youth, they urged me, was meant for raising hell. Hell raising, according to my workmates, was a matter of drinking hard and of spending Saturday nights with girls whose names a man would forget by the time he told the story Monday. Monday mornings didn't find me bragging of such exploits, though. Though I went for beers and bowled sometimes, and even learned to hunt, I disappointed my adopted brothers. Brothers shouldn't speak with their brothers' wives with quite the ease that I did. Did they think that noticing a different hairstyle or knowing where to find the shoes to match that handbag was flirting? Flirting was what they called it to my face, though behind my back they muttered other things. Things at work have improved only slightly since I met and married Bonnie. Bonnie hoped our first would be a boy, so I haven't shared with her my relief that we're having a girl. Girl 1, I hope, of 2 or 3 to come. Come to me, my daughters, and bring me home to the House of Women.
Thank you so much. That was excellent. Great reading. So I always like teaching this one because I think sometimes people sort of catch the form right away or they don't. So I guess I feel like it's an easy question, but what do you notice about the way that he has chosen to write this story?
I notice that he starts a sentence sometimes with a word or a part of a word that he ended the sentence before, hell and hell raising. He does that several times. Parts were the vehicle of my initiation. Yeah, it kind of helped in the reading, really. Hunting was for me a mystery. Blood mysteries in our house were different. It kind of kind of made it into kind of almost as if I was singing a song.
Absolutely. And he, that's exactly right. And he does it every time, which I think is amazing. Like, it's a hard thing to do. It's almost like a poetry move, almost like a sestina, where you have like your 6 end words that you just have to keep hitting. And he calls it a word loop. So if you read this and you like this form, it's a word loop because it keeps looping. If you didn't like the form, it's okay. We're only reading one, so don't worry. But I do agree, Mike, that it's sort of like it gives it almost like a musical quality for sure. And I think, he has to be pretty ingenious about how to do it so it doesn't get too cute or too gimmicky. And so I think the other thing I like about this, the word loop is the obvious thing. But I think what else is cool is the way he uses syntax. And I think when you're writing anything, you want to make sure your sentences have variety and that they create surprise and that they have rhythm. But I think especially in a flash, there can be a tendency, because you want to be so compressed, to just do like short, punchy, subject predicate kind of sentences. And it's much more effective if you focus on varying your syntax. And so you can see there's sentences that he does that are really short and punchy, and then some where he lets them get long and clause filled, some where he kind of breaks them up with a pause or like reported dialogue, like when he says youth, comma, they urged me, comma, was meant for raising hell. So I think the way that he manipulates the syntax to keep things from getting too repetitive just because he keeps repeating words is really smart. And then just to be a little less Socratic so we have time for writing, he does this sort of, I think, really cool thing where it would be easy. This is so generative, right? If you know that you're writing a sentence where the last word is going to become the first word of the next sentence, you could get really indulgent and just go forever, right? That's truly a perpetual motion machine, right? It would self-generate until your natural death, if you wanted to do nothing else. But that's not a good story, right? A story has to have an arc. And so it can be unconventional, it doesn't have to just be the conflict crisis resolution. But the way he makes this go somewhere, I think, is really impressive. The way he sort of does like the summary and then like little mini scenes within it, and then sort of ends with this like sweep to the future, right? This wish to take me home to the House of Women. So you can probably guess where we might be headed with this. I'm going to ask you all to write your own word loop. So I won't give you content. I would just say, see what happens. Because I think, sometimes having content in mind, like if you can think like he does, right? He's doing this intergenerational familial thing, and family is kind of a cycle that repeats. So I think a word loop is good if you compare your content to your form. But I also think the great thing about a word loop is all you have to do is write one sentence and then you're good, right? You already have the start of your next sentence. You can also kind of just surprise yourself. So whichever sounds good to you, have at it. And we'll do roughly 8 minutes of writing, and then we'll talk about how it felt. Good luck looping. About 5 more minutes. About 2 minutes. And if you get stuck or feel like you're finished, don't forget to have a title. I think titles can be hard, so have fun titling your piece. All right, so that's about time. You may have noticed the sort of self-generating perpetual motion machine, but hopefully you found a way to kind of like make it go somewhere. Or if you weren't able to do that in 8 minutes, which isn't very long, you might have ideas for how to do that on your own. But as usual, the question, same as before, we don't have time to share what you wrote, but how did it feel? Like, did you love it? Did you hate it? Was it cool to always know which word was going to come next, or was it frustrating? How did it go?
I loved it. I had so much fun doing it. It was hard, but it was really fun. But like you said, it's hard to get a beginning, middle, and end, because I was fine like going and I have to go somewhere. So
Yeah.
that was the challenge, but I enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. And I think, for me, when I've tried to write these, I feel like I often, this is one where I do a subtractive method after. I think it can be fun to just like let this one rip and see what you get. And then you can go back in and tweak it afterwards, and you can like splice sentences together. Like if you really want to be like Bruce and be perfect, you can kind of like retrofit it. So I think, yeah. Other reactions or observations or experiences.
I think both.
Oh, go ahead, Michael. I'm sorry.
I think both of them, both of the exercises really kind of open themselves up to discovering what I'm writing about, so that I don't really know what to tell you, except that there's a generative experience that I happened upon about the time when we quit. I really like the starting the sentence with a word, the perpetual loop. I really like this. This is going to be, I think I'm going to play with this for a while.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I think to me this is like the most poetic of flash forms, and I know that you're a poet too, so I think it's got that poetry appeal.
Yeah.
Denise, did you wanna?
Yeah, I enjoyed this much more than the first one, but it felt very it kind of just started off and just took off. Felt a little more sing-songy, like da 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 da, da, you know.
Yeah.
I definitely have to go back and edit, but I like this technique a lot. It really flowed.
Yeah, and to kind of build off that, Anna says just in the chat, I liked it, but it does feel gimmicky, but it keeps me writing. I did end with whole and start with whole once. Is that a thing? Yes, that for two, I'll start with the easy part first. Yes, that is a thing. You can use homophones, like sound alike words that have different meanings. I think that's actually like a really slick way to do this and to get that repetition with some variation. And then I think kind of like in my comment before about how sometimes you can kind of let this one rip and then retrofit it to be perfect. I think to combat that gimmicky feeling, Anna, if you feel like it gets too sing-songy, you can kind of do this and let it generate, and then you can always take it out of a word loop. I think this can be a good one to do as like a first draft, and kind of like Michael was saying, like see what you want to write about, and then once you see it, you can go back in and sparse it out, and so it's not as fixed form, if that makes sense. I think I'm explaining that right. And then Kim says, I struggled with the one word and found myself repeating the last few words in some of the sentences. Love that, Kim. I think that's a great thing to do too. Like you can use this as a way to create different kinds of repetition. And what you're describing to me sounds like writing a villanelle, where I think some of the best villanelles don't just repeat the refrain. That's that very strict poetic form, like Elizabeth Bishop's One Art, the art of losing isn't hard to master, that famous one. But where they change it up, like you're saying, and don't just like hit one thing the same every time, but kind of like do the form, but break the rules a little bit. So I love that. So I think, we could, talk about word loops all night, but unfortunately it's already 7:24. Like, I don't know about you, that the hour flew by. So we have 6 minutes left, and I have one more thing that I want to do. First, I want to invite you all to my workshop next week, nonfiction. It'll be similar but different. And then also a reminder about the YA author that the Evergreen Park Library is hosting. Don't miss that. But I dropped it in the chat a little ways up, but it's, I'm not going to sit here and read all of this, but I'm going to touch on this a little bit. So I'll share my screen again. But this is a older but really good, I think, list by this guy Randall Brown, who's one of the people who runs flashfiction.net. And as you can see, this is from 2009, but good advice never goes bad. So he kind of walks through what he considers the 11 essentials to writing great flash fiction. And so I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I just, I want to get these things in your head while you're sitting here thinking like, okay, what did I do? How could I do better? What could I do next time? He says, have strong desires, create an immediate urgency. He says, twist expectations from the outset. He says, create tension through revelation rather than omission. And I'm going to linger on that one a bit because, again, I sort of touched on this at the beginning, where I think sometimes, not just Flash, but stories in general, beginners think like, oh, I have to, make the story like a riddle and keep people reading until the end, where then I reveal that it was all a dream or something like that. And that's, I think we've all read that story, and it's frustrating. So I like that he says, reveal stuff, and you'll create more tension that way than if you hold everything to a punchline at the end. He says, use specificity to create the supernatural. I think, we didn't really talk about this yet, but I think you kind of saw it in the Julio Ortega example, where sometimes flash fiction can have this tendency toward surrealism or strangeness. And I think, his point about using very concrete, realistic details to create that strangeness is really good. He says, make a truth rather than a twist, the goal of your ending. Again, he's sort of cautioning against that gotcha ending. He says, use dialogue to dig deeper. And I think, we didn't talk about it a lot, but you don't have a ton of time in flash fiction to do traditional dialogue where you take up a whole page with the he said, she said tags and a lot of subtext and a lot of back and forth. But I think if you, go back and look at the stories, the judicious use of dialogue, right? Like where, Penny says, I love you, it's too late. This is already serious. I love you more than I love my own children, right? That's dialogue. There's hardly any dialogue, but like, holy cow, like that's deep dialogue. Figure out what you as a writer desire to know. Kind of going back to that comment, like, what do I want? What am I wanting to talk about? Compress to charge sentences. Create weighted images and patterns, right? We just read a very pattern heavy story. Avoid ready-made phrasings. I think, any writer hears this all the time, don't use cliches, but I think in flash fiction especially, where every word counts so much, you definitely want to make sure that they're your words and not somebody else's or some idiom. And then finally, I kind of mentioned it in the last prompt, use words in the title that create multiple meanings. I think, I won't show it tonight, we're almost out of time, but Michael Martone, who's a great Indiana writer, has a couple flash fictions where the titles, like he's doing kind of a cute thing, but the titles are almost as long as the flash. And you can't get away with that every time, but I think that can be a fun thing to do. And even if you don't do that, you can just use your title to kind of get a lot of information out so you can hit that 1,000-word mark more effectively. So I dropped those in the chat because I know that was fast and I know you can read on your own and I don't want to just sit here and read at you. But I think those tips are worth looking at as you go forth on your own to make more flashes. So any final